Hey, welcome everyone. This is a session from Kitchener Developer Group. And in this session today, we have Kirupa from Salesforce, and he's going to explain how we can use styling hooks to customize our LWC. Quick introduction about myself. My name is Shudipta Dev. I'm a Salesforce independent technical architect. I am a platform champion from Canada. This is my blog where I keep on sharing my knowledge about Salesforce. I am a 12 times Salesforce certified. I have 12 Salesforce certification, and I'm also a Salesforce certified application architect. As you know, I'm leading the Kitchener Developer Group. I have more than 400 Trailhead badges, and this is my Twitter handle. So without any further delay, I would like to hand over this to Kirupa.
All right, perfect. Well, hi everyone. I'm pretty excited to be here. Sudipta pinged me, I think, almost a month ago, and it was like styling hooks is something your team is talking a lot about. It would be great to get a session going, and it's like why not? That sounds like a great idea. And we haven't really talked too much about styling hooks and some of the capabilities we've added to our capabilities on styling web components and doing all the things to kind of go beyond the default look and feel you always get. And so I'm pretty excited to be here to kind of talk to you about how do we style Lightning Web Components. And so pretty stoked on like what some of the feedback you all might have, and hopefully see some of these live demos and put all the words and pictures into some actual shipping code. So just to kind of set some, it's a Salesforce presentation, so I have to essentially always make sure that even what I'll be showing you is future facing, it's beta, it's things that we're working on, and whatever you're doing in terms of your purchasing decisions, make sure you do that based on what's available in market and not on things that I'm showing you. They make me say this, so just bear with me on that one. So the next step, of course, is thank you. A lot of the work that we do is entirely driven by feedback and input that you have all given to us on a regular basis, many years ago. And all the work that you all do kind of inspires us to kind of do better in areas where we find there are gaps. We want to make our programmatic platform just more easy to solve the things that you want to do, because at the end of the day, our goal really is to make sure your data and the workflows that you're really enabling are successful. And a big part of it is the feedback that you all provide. So just want to say thank you one more time on all the great work that you all do day in and day out to make basically my life much easier in terms of like what I have to work on. So a little bit about me. I never quite know what exactly to provide here. So my name is Kirupa. I'm a product manager on the UI platform team at Salesforce. The two areas that I primarily focus on are the Lightning design system and our base component areas. And instead of like giving you a bio, I figure there's probably a lot more you can learn about me if I just show you all the emojis I use a lot. We have Anisha on the call. She's a product manager on the SLDS team as well, and she can probably concur that I like to use emojis probably a little too much for formal work kind of situations. So I wrote a script a while ago to kind of go through my Slack messages and emails and just pick out the emojis I use. And so you can see a lot of them right here. And so yeah, so I'll just let this be the primary way you all get to have an impression about me, good or bad. I will leave it up to all of you. And so now let's get to the real topic that I want to talk to all of you about, which is really styling web components, more specifically Lightning Web Components, the Salesforce view of how web components should work. Now, before I get into styling story directly, I kind of want to jump between a little bit of history of web components, what makes them interesting, why we invested in them, with a slight skew towards the styling angle of it. Because I know many of you already are familiar with web components, have probably seen many Trailhead courses and sessions at Dreamforce or Trailhead, or even at user groups. And so I'm kind of trying to give you a different view of the web component story that is less on the technical details or implementation details, but more on the user experience and the expressiveness it gives you in being able to modify your UI in the ways that you might want. And so if I had to start at the very beginning, I go all the way back to probably like 20 years ago, really, there are three distinct paths that many of you may have taken in your Salesforce journey. You have Classic, which is the classic UI that was really the part of what made Salesforce the first stage of like a web-based CRM product. We evolved that with Lightning, but it was based on the Aura framework, was still a little bit of server-side code, a little bit of client-side code, but it was a happy medium between making web developers and transitioning from a more traditional Java world more easy. And today, really, the world is around Lightning Web Components, which is really taking all this knowledge that is existing in the web development community, pure HTML, pure CSS, and pure JavaScript, and trying to do what we can to make all the data in Salesforce really come to life. And so the focus really is today going to be on, I love Classic, I love Lightning. A lot of people work on it. Many of you may be working on it, but the focus will really be on Lightning Web Components and some of the big investments you're making to make styling specifically much easier. So what are Lightning Web Components? The generic, I went to LWC.dev, the primary website for it, and I copied and pasted this right in. It's really just a new programming model for building Lightning components, which we've had for a long time. And the points that I want to emphasize is that these components are built around web standards. There are HTML specs for a lot of these names that I'm going to be mentioning, like custom elements, templates, shadow DOM, CSS custom properties, decorators, modules, and more. A lot of it just me name dropping just to show that it's following web standards. The areas we're focusing on more, which I will dive into much greater detail, are these two major concepts, which is really shadow DOM and CSS custom properties, because these two will really play a big role in what I like to cover as for the styling story that will make web components and our styling work just possible. So one of the big benefits with LWC, Lightning Web Components abbreviated, is its dependency on custom elements and the shadow DOM, and the new and improved way of styling that really works for web apps that we all tend to build today. And this is an important detail to kind of highlight because the web has existed for a very long time. We've had web pages from like probably, almost 30, 35 years ago, where you had document-centric information, where the goal was to view large amounts of text and navigating between pages with large amounts of text. Like that's really the center of gravity for the web. It wasn't really designed for a lot of things that we're doing right now. And so you can imagine that Wikipedia is a great example of what the web was really intended to support. You can even think of it as a primitive version of Wikipedia where you didn't even have like images or media or anything like that. And also put Netscape in that's like the topic because Netscape was one of the first browsers that was created to help make navigating all these documents of text much, much easier. And Craigslist, for a variety of reasons, maintains that kind of, that retro look and feel even today, despite it being also almost 20, 30 years old. And, we've kind of gone beyond that in a bit. Here's an example of Amazon where you have a lot of text, but it's now mixed with like lots of information. But really the crux of it is that it's still very text-based. It's really document heavy. It's still something that is really designed for what you might see in a book, for example, just with more interactivity. But the interesting part, though, is that over the years, the technologies, the HTML, the CSS, and JavaScript, they've evolved. While they might have had their roots in being very document centric, they were either directly, improved, or people just used them in ways that they weren't intended to create experiences that were more natural and app-like. And one of the big changes was a focus on user experience. It wasn't really just about like, what is the shortest path to getting my data onto the screen, but how can I make that more intuitive? How can I use it to really solve people's problems in a way that is more focused on how we can simplify their life, shorten their time to complete a task, as opposed to just purely looking at it from a technical angle. And so you started getting more interactive content. Like when Google Maps first came out, it was a complete game changer in like how you might have thought about navigation, especially in terms of the browser. I'm old enough to remember when MapQuest and AOL Maps were like the primary interactor with something. And I don't know if you all remember this, but the way you would go from from like one screen to another is you had these little buttons you'd click and the entire page would refresh. There was no like clicking and panning on the screen or like gradually going like zooming in and out and seeing all these things. This was like a case where it literally was a case of like I'm turning a page in a book to see it. So when Google Maps came out, that was huge. It was a big difference, and it was all built on web technologies. And then you have Twitter, which also did something similar, where you have real-time communication and messaging with media and all these pieces that go into place. Pinterest, took the idea of like I have technology, but instead of it being something that a centralized user or centralized website gives me information on, I build my own experience around it. And how do I enable all these things to be a more personalized experience where all the content I see is my own? It's not something that I'm creating or someone else is creating for me, which is another big difference in like how technologies have evolved to focus more on us as users and less on the organization behind it. And of course, to go a little bit more meta, here's an example of this slide deck in Google Slides. I did not build this using like PowerPoint or like a desktop app. I used the browser, mostly because Salesforce only supports Google Slides for us to use. But ignoring that for a fact, though, I'm a big believer in using the web for all these things because it's possible, it's easy to use, and it's convenient. And so what really came out of this is web developers, the industry, we're great at coming up with names for very obvious things after it's already happened. And so an example of what I've shown you right now is now can be bucketed under this phrasing called single page apps, or SPA for short. And many of you may have seen this terminology across a lot of the things that you're seeing right now. And the big thing about single page apps is that you might have a view, you might have an area on your page, and this area might be made up of multiple different views you might be seeing on screen. And what happens is that when we look at how these elements are built, it's no longer a case where you have, when you're navigating between one page to another, it's totally feasible to like have your entire UI tear down and be rebuilt. When you're creating a cohesive experience, we have single page applications where your primary views is the same, but parts of it will be changing where data is dynamic. The way we might be building some of these apps will be very, very different. In this case, I can see the UI that I have. It's not monolithic. It's made up of smaller components. I can see there's like 3 big pieces of view at the top, but these can be composed into smaller and smaller pieces. This idea of composability, something that's always existed in programming, especially in object-oriented programming, started to be used in the case of our UI development as well. And this meant that our traditional approaches for building UIs will not scale. The document-centric model where everything's just like a giant block of text or a giant block of pretty much a document, has to be more focused, more self-contained. And so the composability part, where modern apps are composable and made up of smaller and smaller parts, which combine to create larger parts of things, don't just apply to the structure of the page. They also apply to styling as well, because all the content you create needs to look a certain way. And how do you make styling work where this kind of approach actually does really well? And the punchline really is that CSS, cascading style sheets, the primary language which we define our styles in the web today, they were not designed for a composable world. They were still designed for a world where you had a page where everything went through and like styled everything on, that matched a particular pattern that you might have. Because, the thing that made CSS great, and also the bane of many of our existence, is its cascading nature, where you specify style in a parent, it has the ability to influence the styles of a child element or a descendant. And, that's the way it really worked. And that, it's great for documents. It does not work in a world where you have composition, where you have smaller elements make up larger elements, where what you really need is what we like to call style encapsulation. So, what might be very simple in terms of like, here's some heading colors, here's some text and things like that, doesn't really work. And so much of the web, though, is entirely based on this idea of cascading and of inheritance. So here's an example where, not to go too detailed on this, but you can see that, I have a heading 2 style that's like at the very bottom that says it's Helvetica and basic fonts, but that same style is being modified multiple times through each layer of indirection and styling, which again is great for a documentation kind of a site. But if you're trying to create something that I can take from one part of my page to another, you want to basically be decoupled from having to have this tight relationship between a parent and a child, or some arrangement of elements. And so really the big challenge is really this, how do we take CSS that has existed for a very long time, and how do we make, there are 2 things we want to make them do. How do we make them be self-contained, so styles apply to just the reusable element, and is there a supported mechanism where we can override and set styles on a reusable element from parent element? What seems like, very simple problem space here is really, I just want to style this little widget and not have it be applied to the entire page. And that's where web standards have yet again come to the rescue. And the 2 things that really make the solution happen from a solution point of view is this. For the first part, where we want to have styles to be self-contained and to be just a reusable element, there's the shadow DOM, a big capability that is a part of web components. And then to have a supported mechanism where we can set and override styles on a reusable element from a parent element, we have what are known as CSS Custom Properties. You may also see them referenced as CSS variables. And so the shadow DOM, just to dive a little bit deeper into what exactly they do, it's a part of the web component standard, and it helps to isolate the internals of a component from the rest of the document. including styling. And if a typical web page you might be going to, you might go to view source, you might be able to see the DOM of like, or the internal HTML structure for everything that goes on your page. But what the shadow DOM does is it creates a barrier where it says, you do not have access to the internals of this particular element. You can only see the end result of it. You might see a representation of it in its final form, but you cannot see the actual internals that make up the final form itself. And the benefit is this protects us from breaking CSS changes, global styling, or any of the side effects of cascading, which are not beneficial in an application-based world. So if I had a widget and I was going to be placing it with other widgets, this looks like almost like a Pinterest kind of a clone, I can be very confident that I would not have to worry about, the UI changing color or like changing shape or anything like that. It's going to be in its final representation wherever it is. That confidence you don't really have with a typical web development scenario, but with the Shadow DOM, you get that ability to do so. The second one is custom properties. And the nice thing with properties, especially about programming background, is they're very much like variables you might have in JavaScript, for example. The way you use them is, and I'll just go right to this example right here, where I have a variable called myAlign, its value is center. And now the benefit of variables, just like in any situation, is that if I want to specify this variable, I can now just go to any CSS property, and instead of actually typing in center 2 times, I can just reference the myAlign variable, and the end result will be the value of center gets specified. And the benefits, of course, are if I decide to change it from center to left, I don't have to go and adjust every usage of the property. I just have to go and change this variable in one location, and then everything that's using it automatically gets it. The benefits that we have with variables, you now have in CSS as well. And CSS custom properties allow this to work in a way that, makes this all really simple. So the major takeaway, as part of just like wrapping up the introduction to web components and the styling angle to it, is that with Shadow DOM, you get style encapsulation, where styles neither leak in nor leak out. And with custom properties, you have the ability to customize the parts of the UI that have been exposed for customization. So you can imagine that I can have a handful of properties. I go to a developer and say, you can modify these things. And the end result is those properties are what gets modified. No more do you have this complication of like, things getting misaligned. And so now let's segue into Lightning Web Components and our interpretation and application of all of this work, which is really what we like to call styling hooks, which is our way of styling a lot of our componentry. And so the way you specify styling hooks is exactly the same way as a CSS custom property. They are just CSS custom properties. We're just calling them styling hooks because it's an easier, much simple way to remember them, and also better search for them. It's like, I'm searching for styling hooks as opposed to having to type in custom properties and then being inundated with a lot of other results. And what styling hooks do is they offer an easy and supported way of making styling customizations to any web component, especially Lightning Web Component, such as the base components, which many of you use to define the UI that you typically like to use. And when I talk about base components, I think many of you have been to this web page, which is really our component reference, where you can see the 80 or 90 components that we have that allow you to have simple things like a button or input, or more elaborate things like, for example, an accordion or like a carousel, where you can have some interactivity, but your data is represented visually through any of these combination of 80 elements. And so what styling hooks allow you to do really is that you can have a common UI. I can see this example where I have a pill, I have some text, and I have a button with a background. And I can now customize the look and feel inside a web component, Lightning Web Component environment, without having to do or jump through any specific hoops. We're just using standard web standards, and we're able to make this all just work just fine. And when it comes to styling hooks, what are the styling hooks that are available? How do I know that what I can specify to override something? That is covered on the Lightning Design System website, where for every component where we have styling hooks exposed, you can scroll down and you can see that in this case, I'm on button, and I can see all the various styling hooks that I can set to override various properties of a button. And I'll get back to this like particular documentation and some of the things we have in the future shortly. But what I want to do first, though, is just really get to a demo and kind of talk about how do we take what I've just shown you and actually apply it to something that works. So let me go and exit my presentation. And right now what I have is I'm in webcomponents.dev, which is like the new playground that we have for being able to see the current pages and what we're doing. And what I have here is a web component. I'm going to go to HTML to show you what's going on here. You can see that it's just a typical template. It's a Lightning Web Component, nothing fancy. I have a Lightning card. I have some div elements here. And what you're seeing on the screen is in many ways a live version of the screenshot that I had in my slides where I was just showing you some examples of what's going on. So on the surface, you can see that this looks like a typical component you might be building for Salesforce. I'm using base components, not specifying anything that is too far out there. It's following a typical format where I have my JavaScript, where it's like some basic things that just essentially creates a web component. And then I want to modify the look and feel of it. And then I could go to, let's say, my CSS and make the changes. So let's say that I want to change the color of this button or the background of this button. Right now, it is like, it has no background to it. And I want to make the modification. So what I can do is I can go to my buttons, I can go to my documentation, and I can see that there's a lot of properties here. The one that is representing the background is this one, which says SDSC button color background. And it's a color value. By default, it is transparent. That, the default value is interesting to know if I set it of what's going to be, but I want it to be a different color. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in the selector post, and I'm going to specify the name of the property, SDSC button color background. And let's pick a color. Let's make it yellow. I'm just going to make it something that's very, very obvious what's going to happen. So I made the change and I hit save. And now let's go and see what happens. And now you can see that the color is yellow. Actually, let me make it black, just so it's much more obvious on screen sharing, because yellow might be too subtle. So I'm making the background color black. And now you can see that the button has now a black color around it. And the reason it works is that, we did a lot of work both on the styling layer, but also on the markup and the component layer to map all these various properties that are brand new. They didn't exist, I know, before before a few releases ago, where you can now specify this color, and now the color is automatically applied. You no longer have to type the selector name. You don't have to go like my button.div.background. You don't have to do anything complicated like that anymore. All you have to do is specify this value. The internals of how this button works and how it's represented is no longer an issue for us to focus on, because the shadow DOM will eventually prevent us from being able to see the internals. And so this is a very supported, easy way to style it without having to make any special changes. So let's go a little bit more elaborate, because in the slides, I kind of showed you how you can go much further than just like making one minor change. And to save you all the hassle of watching me write all these properties and values and probably miss a colon or something here and there, I'm going to copy and paste some stuff that I just created earlier and just show you what's going to happen. And so let me just override this with some properties that I've specified already. And let me just make sure the formatting is right. And what I've specified here are just more custom properties or styling hooks for, in this case, the card, various styling elements for the card. We have a badge component here, so I'm specifying a badge color background to change the badge color, and then various properties on the button itself, everything from the text color to the how it starts and ends, like in the layout of it, and also the radius and what things will look like. So let's go ahead, save, and see what this makes our final card, what experience will look like in this case. So I'm hitting save. And now you can see that the card looks very different. The pill looks very different. It's like it doesn't have like a nice white background. There's a different level of spacing, and it's more personalized by the kind of look and feel that I'm going for, because I may want to override things and customize it in a very friendly way that is not tied to the implementation of the component itself. If you want to go even further, this is a very mild adjustment to what we had. For any of you, maybe like, wait, what changed? In this case, you're going to see a much more drastic change where we're going to be changing the color to be more of a like a dark mode kind of a look and feel. So I hit save. It's going to take a moment to update, and something. Oh yeah, it did work. You can see that there's like a light green background. There's a slight different shade, of variation that happened behind it. And just because, okay, I didn't actually rehearse this, but I do want the card itself to be a darker color than what it is right now. And so I'm going to go ahead and change this to, let's say, just black. Will this make the entire card have a black background? No, it doesn't. I think there's something, I think there might be a slight bug either in our code, or it might be something in like the preview that's going on here. But at least, I was able to validate live with you that there's a bug somewhere, which is always a great thing to do in a presentation. But now, let me go back to the slides a bit and talk a little bit about both what we were supposed to see, and then also like just what we're supposed to see was essentially this, like updating the background should have created something that looks kind of like this dark version, the customer B version of it right here. But we'll get that figured out. Like the big thing to call out here is that the styling capability I'm showing you, it's beta. It's a beta feature. We shipped it a few releases ago, and our goal is to keep working on it, keep addressing bugs like this, for example, and also add more capabilities. And we'll touch upon that later, where there may be properties that you would like us to expose that we don't expose currently, and I want to know about them. I want to make sure that I have that list so that in a future release, we can prioritize and see how we can make it a part of our overarching roadmap. And so to not go into great detail on like the implementation of like how this works, but here's an example where by default, if I wanted to create like a small version of like highlighting the new Spider-Man movie, I can create it using our default components, get a default look and feel. But with styling hooks, I can modify it to have a more custom expression. So here you can see that the pill that is normally rounded with a gray border has a more pronounced look. It's not doesn't have a color background anymore, but it has a border that is blue and it's less rounded, or the button itself looks very different, or the typography treatment is different as well. Notice there's no underline in about in this case. And the way this was done is, again, entirely through just specifying CSS custom properties. In this case, I specified some properties to simplify my own world of having my brand colors be easily represented. And then I use the styling hooks from our documentation to specify what these values would be. Again, there's no point am I specifying the styling selectors or going into like any kind of a complicated path to get to my elements. I just know that I want to update my component. And so what's the component property? I specify the value for that. And then I use the typical CSS custom properties syntax for being able to set them. And so a great place for to see more of these things live and you can inspect in your browser is stylinghooks.com. And you will figure out a way to get you a list of all of these links after this meeting. But if you go to stylinghooks.com right now, you'll get to see a static page with all of these components that I just showed you, and a lot more examples actually that go into a lot more detail of like what you can do by default and how far you can use styling hooks to really take the user experience in a Lightning Web Component world and really make it pretty much your own. And so with that, I kind of just want to take a pause here and open up the floor for any questions that you all may have, discussion points, or even go back and like talk to any part of my demo that I might have rushed right through. So I'm gonna close this full screen so I can see all of you on screen again and stop my sharing. But yeah, I'd like to just open up the floor for questions.
Hey Kirupa, this is Sudipta here. So I have one question here. Like I saw that you put all your styling with the host keyword, right?
Yeah.
But in the reality, when we create those LWC component, I don't use the host keyword. Like what is the reason? Like why you have used the host?
It was purely just convenience for demo purposes. You can specify it in any format that you would like it to do. You don't have to actually put it in host. You can have your own specific selector. You can specify, for example, a class selector and say my button is going to be, my button's going to have a class value of my button. And in your
Correct.
CSS, actually just target .my button as your selector and then put your custom properties in there directly. Good question.
Okay. Yep. There is one question from Mark. Will VS Code support autocomplete for the styling hooks?
Yes, that's on our roadmap. We do have some plans on supporting it. We don't have an exact time frame though on when we will have it. Many of you probably know that we have the SLDS validator as part of the Salesforce extension pack, and we do work on ensuring that as a developer on LWC, you get nice autocomplete, you get good integration with VS Code, because that's the editor that a lot of you use. That's the one that I personally use as well. So there's like a lot of interest in making the overall experience of using VS Code for building these things easier. And so the answer is yes, time frame TBD.
I have one more question. All the styling hooks, right? They are good for the community as well.
Yes.
Okay, so there is no extra, like no separate kind of styling hook for the community and non-community. It's the same styling hook. Okay.
Correct. What we've documented right now is really that, it's available for anyone to specify. We used to have the idea of like, for internal implementations, you have a specific version of like, we call tokens that you can specify. We're kind of moving away from that model. Right now, our view is like, you use your best judgment. Every company and customer has a requirement that is very unique to their needs. And we want to be an enabler and help you make those designs successful.
Awesome. There's few more questions. The next question is from Eric. Is there a roadmap for adding this to other component, for example, data table?
Yes, our roadmap is, our goal is to keep adding more versions of, both more styling hooks and styling hooks on more components based on feedback and need. And one of the things actually, let me actually share my screen here because I think this part is actually, important to kind of highlight, is let me go to the page that I need to get to. And I'm going to share my screen one more time.
Mhm.
Is okay. And so for all the styling hooks that we have on the Lightning Design System website, if you go to Lightning Hooks styling hooks page, we talk a little bit about like both the first, it's a beta feature, so it's in preview, and so we're still working on it. And so one of the links you'll see is like a styling hooks feedback form. I highly encourage all of you to use this form and let us know both like what styling hooks we should expose, because we expose the things that we know from our own usage from this telemetry and customer data, what we think is the right properties to expose. But you might have like a request for like there might be, just to give a random example, I'm not saying it's a good example, but you might want to have like, let's say, a CSS filter exposed as something that should be a styling hook. In those cases, please fill this form out, let us know, and we will use your feedback in many ways to prioritize what we work on in the future. And that also includes, for example, additional components that we want to support as well. Right now, we're focusing on the more primitive, more reusable, common components like all of your buttons and inputs and elements like that. But we do want to target all of the custom experience components and data table and all the components that you're building as well. At some point, we'll be able to use styling hooks also because there's custom properties. So nothing prevents you from creating an experience component that has your own version of, like, let's say, like a range slider, for example, and the knob that makes the range slider work, you're tying it into the appropriate styling hook for what that would be. So that way, if someone sets the styling hook at, like, let's say, the parent level or host, for example, your UI is also customized like you would expect, as opposed to you having to use a different mechanism for it. And that's one of the benefits of us betting on web standards, is that what we're doing is really just providing guidance and shortcuts, but the default web behavior is what will kick in. So that's one of the major advantages of us taking the approach.
Okay. What's the next question? Next question is like, what will be the support for IE?
Yes. For IE, the support is something that we're still, investigating and working on. But the primary focus is on modern browsers, because CSS custom properties only work on the modern browsers. And so the plan really is for IE to have functionality that's always worked like it has before. So if you do set up theming and branding, you'll get the appropriate behavior. But the styling hook level of like custom look and feel, that may be something that we have to investigate, and maybe it will not work as we might want it to. Anisha has the question: what kind of global styling hooks can we expect? And that is something that we're actively working on right now. And to set some context on what we're referring to here, right now we have the ability to set styling hooks on a per component basis or on a per parent element basis and have it cascade down. But let's say, for example, you want your entire page to have, like, every button on your page, you want it to be blue. And it would be kind of, like, extra work to have to go through every parent container and specify, SDS button background color blue, SDS button background color blue. And so what global styling hooks allow you to do is go to, as high of a level on your page that you have access to, and specify, I want my global color for all buttons on my page to be blue. I want the global text for all of my buttons to be white. And you specify that just once, and every element automatically inherits that, which is a really good convenience if you think about like theming and like larger set of like changing styles without like having to focus on a very narrow part of your UI. And so we're working through that right now. That, my expectation is that all of the very common things you would want to set, like a lot of your colors and a lot of your, basic like customization capabilities, like, that are you would want in a theming capability, they will all be exposed. And again, this goes back to that form I highlighted earlier. Once we have like what we ship, we want to keep evolving, we want to keep adding more things to it. So we look to all of you to give us feedback on what additional styling hooks to expose, whether it's local or global. That what your use cases will really drive what we do there.
On this global styling, I have one question here. Like, is it possible to have a branding as well? Like, let's say, TD Bank, right, which is all green, CIBC, which is all red, right? Can you have a branding at the org level, and all the custom component that we develop will inherit the branding?
Yep. And that is something that we're working through right now. I don't have a good answer just yet, But the goal really is to, longer term, provide the same level of, app-wide or org-wide theming using CSS Custom Properties. So that way your entire app itself can have that look and feel. Right now, the primary way many of you probably do that theming is you're either writing your own custom code that goes at the root of the page, or you're relying on the color changes you have under setup and themes and branding. And so we're looking at ways of like, how do we kind of marry those two worlds of like what we have today with what we want to have in the future in a more supported fashion. So it's definitely on our roadmap, just nothing that we can confirm or have a design for just yet. Yep. So the question is, we set a styling hook on a parent component. Do all the child components include that parent inherit that? Yes, they do. It follows the common CSS custom properties cascading rules in that sense.
Okay. What about if we use any other UI framework, not the SLDS? Like, on top of SLDS, we use any other UI framework.
Yep. If you use any other UI framework, as long as the components that you're using as part of this, if they, for example, reference that the background color of my button needs to use, is named SDS-button background color, it'll automatically apply to that as well. We're very implementation agnostic in that particular sense. And also, nothing prevents you from also defining your own custom CSS custom properties, in your own world as well. Like, let's say you're using like, component framework foo that happens to have their own way of specifying custom properties to go through the shadow DOM and work in a web component based world. You can always specify that right alongside your styling hooks that are more SLDS specific, and things will work just fine also. So the mixing and matching, whatever is convenient for you as an admin or a developer or a designer, all those things will be fully supported in this world.
Awesome.
So the question is, we're doing overrides right now to solve this, in community experience style header. Will these break when this goes GA? No, our goal is to, we try our very, very best to never break existing implementations. All these changes are additive. So what worked before should continue to work. And if you want to use this new way of being able to modify look and feel, you'll be able to do that as well. And we work very closely with the communities team on making sure that we evolve a solution that takes their, more custom, more, expansive like customizations into account, whereas you might have more controls and constraints on a typical Salesforce environment. Would an ISV be able to set up their own styling hooks or CSS custom properties for subscriber orgs to consume? That's a good question. Technically, absolutely. Nothing prevents them from being able to provide like, a component or a widget whose primary purpose is to inject CSS custom properties at whatever root level of the page. I think there's some, good points in like, what I like to call just a developer ergonomics. Like, what is the workflow like? How do we make sure that appropriately works correctly? I think that's something that we need to, just document. There are technical solutions for all this already existing. And so we need to figure out the best way to kind of communicate that so people can do it in a supported way. Because one of the things that I didn't emphasize, but I kind of mentioned a few times, is the reason that styling hooks are really appealing is that before we had styling hooks, you could always specify a selector, you could always depend on the DOM structure, whatever arrangement it was, and still be able to style your UI. The problem was that, we've always said in our documentation in all of the various, areas we talk about customization, that that's unsupported. And what that really means is that, with every release, we might decide to add a div element to your buttons, for example, or we might decide to add some span elements for some accessibility reasons. And if your selectors were written in a way where you expected things to be exactly in the right space inside the DOM, you would probably have had to go back and modify your customizations to work with this new environment, which is never a fun place to be, especially if you have a billion other things to do as part of an upgrade. And so what styling hooks really do is they separate out the actual styling that you want to do from the actual implementation, the HTML itself. So if you're setting, let's say, like, the text color, for example, it doesn't matter if in the future we decide to rename the text element from a P element to a heading element or something else. As long as you specify that custom property, you can have a certain level of confidence that we will not ever change the implementation of the representation of the color at some point in the future because of a DOM change.
It's awesome. I don't have any more question here, but anybody, if you have any question, you can unmute yourself or uh, paste in the chat window. No, looks like we don't have any more question. But yeah, it's such a it's a great session, Kirupa. We learned a lot, and to everyone, this session is recorded, and later tonight I'll upload the session in the recording in the YouTube and share the link as well as the presentation. So you will all get an email from me with the recording and the presentation. And thank you, Cuba, for this great session. We definitely learned a lot. We have your contact details, so in case we face any issues, we know who to reach out to.
Absolutely. Thanks, Aditya, for giving me the opportunity to present to all of you. And thanks everyone for the great questions. And, looking forward to connecting with you all offline. You can find me all these places. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be, I'm excited.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice rest of the day.